Last but not least, Professor Mark Somos from the prestigious Heidelberg Institute. Mark is another all-round lawyer with non-legal openness to non-legal. There is a former member of the Supreme Court, former House of Lords in the UK, Lord Sumption. He teaches students, if you want to become a good practicing lawyer, do not graduate in law unless you really intend to study the law as a cultural, intellectual piece of discipline. And so I have much respect for lawyers who are not just lawyers. This makes them better lawyers. Let me again suggest that anyone who does not know you yet well enough to require me to go through your bio note, to go to Google, and they will learn a lot. And just pass the floor on to you, because we're all very curious to hear your views about, I understand that you're probably playing with the motto whereby every road takes you to Rome. So this time you're probably going to prove the exception with regard to the relationship already anticipated by previous speakers, that after all, Grotius and Gentili were not always very much on the same page, or even if when and where they were so, they would not recognize it. Maybe that is a guess. Without further ado, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind invitation and for the generous hospitality. I am very happy to be here, especially because I find myself in the position of Paesinus, Gentili's fictional native of San Genesio, who opens the Armis Romanis wondering, how did apologists manage to convince posterity about the merits of ancient Rome? I would therefore like to use this opportunity to explore a nagging feeling that at some point, ancient Rome, the emperor of sources and authorities for the law of nations, had lost its clothes. I've been trying to suppress this feeling in the face of sources and authorities that I admire, from Hersch Lauterpacht's point about public international law arising from private Roman law, a point that Gentili also made a few times, to Benjamin Straumann's and Daniel Lee's compelling arguments that Gentili and Grotius ascribed even greater authority to Roman law than we have hitherto realized. They are smarter than me, and my analysis may be wrong. But in terms of facts, I am confident that a straightforward reading of Grotius, Selden, Pufendorf, and others yields an extensive catalogue of explicit rejections of ancient Rome's authority and relevance. Apart from the fact that Cicero, whom some modern apologists focus on, isn't exactly Roman law, and even Gentili in De Rebelli, and both Paesinus and his Roman critic in De Armis Romanis mock Cicero repeatedly and savagely. The ubiquitous adoration of Roman law in texts on the law of nations simply isn't there. But the contrary position is. These works contain thousands of outright denials that the known actions and laws of ancient Rome have any binding authority, either due to their consonance with the laws of nature and or nations, or due to their success in ordering Rome and its empire as a quintessential model of civilization, or due to the continuities with Europaea Jus Commune, or Europe's superior grasp of the universal laws of nature, and its consanguineous but contingent cousin, the law of nations. Selden's Mare Clausum is one example. Here, the Roman Empire is one in a chain of maritime hegemons that includes Minos, Rhodes, and Carthage, and culminates in Britain, the first global maritime empire that is eternal and irreplaceable, partly because Britain has become self-aware of its hegemonic status thanks to Selden himself, and has duly and lawfully laid claim to the navigable world. Rome is one of many, and achingly far from the best link on this chain. Selden accepts or rejects Roman precepts relating to high and territorial seas, but never once accords them higher authority than, for instance, roads. Hobbes and Pufendorf similarly go out of their way to specify all the Republican and classical Roman provisions they disagree with, and to tell you why. I know that my claim that we went too far in the direction of attributing influence to ancient Rome in early modern international law, and that we ignore plain evidence to the contrary, is stark and strange. I'll happily supply the catalogue of anti-Roman statements in Selden and Pufendorf. But today, I'd like to discuss the gap between Gentili's and Grotius's approach to Rome, specifically between the Rebelli and the Rebellion Pacis. I'll also draw on the Armis Romanis, since, as Diego Panizza has compellingly shown, much of the relevant action takes place there. Let me note that I disagree with the interpretation that Paesinus is Gentili's true man, or that Book 2 of the Armis faithfully represents Gentili's admiration for Rome. For instance, when Gentili states his own views in the Rebelli, he sometimes repeats Paesinus' views and sources, on Scaevola, on Fabius, on the Saguntines, and in many other cases. Gentili himself also disagrees with the Roman speaker in Book 2 when it comes to the alleged justice of Roman violence, after an enemy has offered compensation, about kings having the power to give away their kingdoms, and other issues. And hilariously, Gentili makes both Paesinus and the Roman miscite well-known sources, then berate each other for doing so. The Armis is a humanist dialogue with two credible sides, not a dully framed piece of propaganda. Yet my chosen prism of the Gentili-Grotius contrast may seem unfit for the purpose, since the gap between their positions on Rome isn't nearly as wide as, say, between Bartolus of the Saxiferato and Marsilius of Padua on the same issue in the 14th. Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, later Pius II, and Nicolas Cusa in the 15th. Vittoria against Suarez and Bodin in the 16th. Simon van Leuven against Cornelius von Winkelschuk in the 17th, or Wolff against Rousseau and Burke in the 18th centuries. There is a long tradition of arguing for and against Rome. The narrow, Gentili-Grotius contrast may not seem the best way of exploring early modern Rome bashing, but to my mind, it is the perfect study, because their disagreement captures a deeper tension concerning methods, sources, and authorities. I know what you're thinking, and I think you are right. The explicit Rome-bashing texts surely tell a story about exemplarity, or analogizing, or probability, or all three and their cognates. Surely the folks I mentioned, from Marsilius to Rousseau, didn't reject Rome as a source or an authority for the law of nations, which would be mad, but reacted against what they saw as invalid deployments of examples, analogies, or generalizations from Roman sources by folks like Bartolus or Vittoria or Wolff. In short, this must be a narrow technical dispute. I sort of agree, but the ways in which I don't is where the nagging factual insight of Rome bashing runs riot. Grotius, Selden, and Pufendorf rejected Rome as an authority and even as a uniquely privileged model for establishing the law of nations, not because of methodological doubts, but because they believed that ancient Rome simply won't cut it in a world of new local customs, religious violence of intensity that Rome had never seen, as Gentili points out, with a new world discovered with latitude and longitude measurable, or in light of intensifying economic complexity. Politically, Rome was a hot potato in a poisoned chalice. You could not use it to serve Marsilius' preference for popular sovereignty and local customs, or Grotius' Batavian defense of independence, or Selden's fondness for the British Empire. Moreover, by the 16th century, the sheer weight and density of rival interpretations of Roman law and history could hardly support a European, let alone global, consensus on the nature and content on the law of nations. As Barberac commented on Grotius' De Rebellia Pacis, after Lorenzo Valla's debunking of the donation of Constantine, even most Catholics didn't believe in continuity between ancient Rome and the papacy or the Holy Roman Empire. It seemed better to start anew from what was in front of us. This was Gentili's ambition, but it's not what he ended up doing in the Rebelli. The reason for the gap between intention and result lies in the incomplete method he had for international law. As you know, some of the incompleteness persists to this day, for instance, in identifying customary international law. Gentili announced that he wished to take reason, natural law, and state practice as sources and authorities for his system of international law, but these containers are meaningless without content. And his principles for selecting content remained inadequate, which drove him back to Rome. Gentili denounced exclusive reliance on Roman law for determining the law of nations, but his dependence on testimonies and exemplarity pulled him back in just when he thought he was out, to cite the Godfather. By contrast, Grotius relegated Rome to relative insignificance, not by shifting emphasis to reason, natural law, or state practice, but by replacing testimonies with verisimilitude as the highest principle for selecting materials from which reason, natural law, state practice, and ultimately international law can be built. I will argue that the reason why Gentili and Grotius are so close, yet so far apart in their uses of ancient Rome, is best understood through a related set of texts concerning Aristotle's poetics. Drafted by Julius Caesar Scaliger, augmented by his son, Joseph Justus Scaliger, and passed on by the son to his student, Daniel Heinsius, whose 1611 De Tragodiae Constitutione emphasized verisimilitude over exemplarity in a way that illuminates the methodological difference between Gentili's and Grotius's books. To reconstruct Gentili's method, my method was straightforward. De Rebelli is a lucid and well-designed text. Gentili follows his methodological introduction with a scrupulously signposted series of arguments. So to assess the role of Rome, I just went through the book, isolated the hundreds of arguments he makes with a pencil, and reviewed all the sources he deploys using the 1599, the 1612 editions, the Carnegie edition, and the Italian editions, and I identified a few things that they missed, mostly Lucian. Gentili loves Lucian. By doing this, I do not claim to have identified all his sources. Rather, I treat Gentili's choices in indicating his sources as significant for understanding both his preferences and the pool and hierarchy of sources that he believed would best persuade his reader about the propositions that he advances concerning the law of nations. The word persuade is key, and we'll come back to it. De Rebelli begins with Gentili's description of his task as an explanation of the laws of war, which is based on natural law and cannot be found in the books of Justinian. He soon reiterates that Justinian, quote, did not go beyond the boundaries of Rome, unquote. And when Justinian discussed the law of nature and nations, he did so from a limited Roman perspective. Commentators such as Baudin and Peter Faber cite Roman law and history to prove contemporary points wrong-headedly, because if you rely on exemplar, you'll find they are so diverse that they don't prove anything. Moreover, they cannot amount to a comprehensive system of law. You can't move from lots of particulars to something universal. According to Gentili, interpreters of Roman law therefore just ignore, completely blank out on the law of nations, which cannot be gleaned from, quote, the laws of Justinian alone, unquote. Another problem with drawing from Roman law, Gentili notes, is that only fragments remain. I mean, what are we talking about? Just we have these precious fragments and no more. And Romans themselves ceased to manage and document their affairs systematically after the end of the Republic. Moreover, non-Romans, such as Aristotle and Plato, provide valuable insights into the laws of nature and nations. And all ancient insights become antiquated anyway. Having given these reasons for the inapplicability of Roman law to current problems, Gentilius starts to discuss particular rules, such that wars can only be waged by the sovereign. He writes, in full frontal self-contradiction, moreover, the law of which is written in those books of Justinian is not merely that of the state, but also that of the nations and of nature. And with this last, it is also in accord that if the empire were destroyed, the law itself, although long buried, would yet rise again and diffuse itself among all the nations of mankind. This elevated Roman source is his only authority. When Gracius speaks of the exact same topic, the first authority he cites is Plato's Laws, followed by Justinian, followed by Augustine. Next, Gentili posits that the link between civil and international law is that Justinian's rules for individuals also apply to sovereigns and thus also to their citizens. This contradicts Gentili's prior assertions that Justinian passages on the law of nations are limited to the historically and culturally contingent Roman standpoint, and that the accumulation of any number of particular Roman examples cannot support universal conclusions. Then, a few chapters later, he addresses the pairing the fate of hostages, making one liable for escape attempts by the other. Gentili reverses his position once more. For men, transfer agreements based upon rulings of the civil law to the principles of the law of nations, whereas both the nature and the method of investigation of the two subjects are different. Discussing whether kings can sell their subjects, Gentili writes, these things, however, are a matter of natural right, like almost everything which is based upon the books of the Digest and the other works compiled and circulated by Justinian. These 5, 6 self-convictions are not insignificant. When Gentili posits a link or even equivalence between Roman and international law, he derives binding obligations, including no harm, good faith, self-defense, permitting and engaging in commerce, among others. Leaving self-contradictions aside, if not Rome, then what are Gentili's ostensible sources for determining the law of nations? According to Gentili, the law of nations can be identified by natural reason and attested by universal adherence. Gentili's authorities for this definition, i.e. for the meta-authority on identifying binding laws of nations, are the Digest, the Institutes, and Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, or Roman. What are Gentili's devices for persuading readers of the aptness of his source and authorities? He likes testimonies, examples, and histories, roughly in this order, and he dislikes verisimilitude. Gentili discusses examples, testimonies, and histories at length. Testimonies carry weight when provided by wise men or reliable witnesses. In his dedicatory epistle to the Earl of Essex, for Book 1 of De Armis Romanis, Gentili promises that the question of Rome's justice will be settled through the critical assessment of testimonies. This chimes with the Roman speaker's conclusion in Book 2. The published work, in short, begins and ends with a methodological discussion about the supreme value of testimonies. Examples are more straightforward. One can prove anything with exemplar, Gentili notes, and more worryingly, given that examples can prove anything, one can render any issue in the law of nations irresolvable by misrepresenting exemplar as authoritative. And yet, giving examples is Gentili's most frequent method in the Rebelli. He is, to his credit, uncomfortable with this, and often discusses their standing as a rhetorical device. With regard to the obligation to negotiate in good faith before commencing hostilities, he notes, but why do I multiply examples, as if anyone could not call to mind a great number of such occurrences in every age? Why? To be sure, in order that those who avoid this kind of contest by arbitration and resort at once to the other, that is to force, may understand that they are setting their faces against justice, humanity, and good precedent. exempla clearly carry weight. Histories are, of course, a staple source for humanist lawyers. The Arbis Romanis begins with Paecinus, calling most historians liars, since most historians praise Rome. By contrast, Paecinus praises the poets, who report Rome's failings as well. Testimonies differ greatly from histories because historians select material based on their trained powers of discernment, and they also add their judgment to descriptions of deeds and words. Remarkably, Paecinus and his Roman adversary then agree to settle the debate by pitching the credibility of Livy against Orosius. In laying down the rules for their contest, the Roman explains that the debate will be won by the party whose historians are shown to command greater verisimilitude. Gentili's Roman uses verisimilitude as a hallmark of good historiography. This is the opposite of the Aristotelian and Grecian definition of verisimilitude as a universal device of persuasion available only to poets and some philosophers, certainly not historians, who deal in particulars. By contrast, Paecinus holds that even testimonies fail without verisimilitude. From surviving fragments of anti-Roman historians, he sets out to prove Roman injustice, even if it does not seem credible or likely, in just the same way that many things are judged to be credible and likely which are in fact false. And you can see from the Latin that this is translated from verisimilitude. Verisimilitude is Paecinus' standard, not the Romans. It is not Gentili's either. He consistently ranks verisimilitude lower than other standards against which rhetorical devices are measured, such as their efficacy or their veracity. Inverting Paecinus' point in his dedication to Essex, Gentili notes that Aristotle and Quintilian are in agreement that verisimilitude often misleads people who believe things that are very similar but are in fact false, just as there are many things that lack verisimilitude but which are in fact true. This problem, Gentili adds, does not arise when assessing writers' competing opinions, especially if they are ancient writers, and their partisanship and bias no longer distort our critical assessment of their views. Similar to the assessment of competing ancient opinions is the exercise of judging testimonies, especially historians who, like lawyers, often judge each other and endow their statements with characteristics that enable the critical assessment of their testimonial value without the confounding effect of verisimilitude. Let us now follow Gentili's method in action. Beirabelli posits hundreds of legal rules, from the lawful use of force through alliance treaties to post limine. Usually, Gentili demarcates the point he is handling with admirable clarity. He generally summarizes the point, then provides examples and testimonies in support, assesses counter-arguments, then flags that he is finished, and moves to the next point. It really is a wonderfully organized treatise, which makes it easier to test the application of his professed method. I went through each distinct argument and noted Gentili's sources, whether legal, historical, biblical, or literary. Roman law and history feature prominently in almost every one of his arguments. In most cases, Gentili adds Greek and biblical sources, reports of barbarians, patristics, medieval incidents, contemporary Turkish conduct and writings, and other legal and historical references. There are, however, about 24 arguments, which I'm not going to go through, out of several hundred for which Gentili draws exclusively on Roman authorities, using all the additions that I have listed. It's about these 24. So we saw Gentili's objections to relying on Roman law and using examples to determine the law of nations, and how he directly and explicitly overruled his own misgivings. We have also seen that Gentili stopped himself from amassing examples endlessly and relied exclusively on Roman law to establish 24 rules. So what is going on? Why does Roman authority resurface from under Gentili's principled objections? One clue is in Gentili's discussion of divine law. Well, again, mistranslated. The relevance of which he repeatedly denies. Like other secularizers, Gentili is strong on epistemic humility and rejects the arrogance of claiming to understand divine law as clearly and consistently as Grotius does. Even the reason of our senses yields to it, i.e. religion. Opinions depend upon probability, understanding upon reason, faith upon authority. Faith does not demand reason, but believes in advance of reason, because nothing is more contrary to reason than to attempt through reason to attain that which is superior to a reason. Opinions depend upon probability is a key and again mistranslated phrase. He's talking about verisimilitude. Gentili stated at the outset that his intention is to generate opinions about the law of nations, to persuade, to motivate to action. The most important source in the Western tradition on persuasion and motivation is Aristotle's Poetics. If you wish to motivate, seriously, in theater, education, pick up any commentary, through any subject and genre, that is where you started. Indeed, in addition to Gentili's fulsome praise for Aristotle, the single most frequently cited text on method in the Rebelli is Julius Caesar Scaliger's Poeticus Libri Septem, in which Scaliger provided a revised theory of persuasion and motivation based on his textual criticism of Aristotle's Poetics. Scaliger's most scathing criticism was directed at grammarians, obsessed with particulars and ignoring universals. Perhaps the most recurring phrase in the Rebelli is that these examples are enough to prove a law and we must move on. Gentili says this, he gives you 50 examples and says, surely this is enough, and moves on. Gentili's contempt for heaping unnecessary examples on top of one another echoes Scaliger's point to a T. So how do we get to universals that in international law that can compel us to action? Aristotle attributes this power to poets and philosophers who, unlike historians, move from universals to particulars. For Gentili, Justinian effectively occupied the rank of a philosopher. Just as Euripides accurately and correctly captured principles of the law of nations in his capacity as a poet, and both Gentili and Grotius loved Euripides. Once we have identified truths about the law of nations, figuring out how to most effectively present these truths to readers is a separate challenge altogether. Examples must be provided, but they must transcend particulars, which they can't. What Gentili needs is examples imbued with some sort of exceptional power, and that is how he uses ancient Rome. 14 years ago, I published a thing on how Heinsius' rearrangement, that's the other book, 1610, with a commentary I did in 1611. On Heinsius' he just recut the Poetics, shuffled a couple of chapters around. It completely changed the nature of the text. So I wrote about how his rearrangement and commentary influenced Grotius' method. At the time, I didn't realize that Julius Caesar Scaliger's unpublished notes on Aristotle, on the Poetics, passed through his son, the great Josephus Scaliger, to Daniel Heinsius. And just how neatly Gentili's death to Scaliger Sr. in the Rebelli mirrors Grotius' death in the Rebelli Pacis to Scaliger Jr. and Heinsius. These Aristotelian commentaries are among the most important texts for the early modern construction of compelling legal arguments. So while this may be an oversimplification, given the plethora of Aristotelian commentators and literary critics knew, including his brother, Scipio, it is not much of an oversimplification. J.C. Scaliger is hands down the most cited rhetorical theorist in the Rebelli, and I've shown Heinsius' impact on Grotius. As you know, by contrast, the current scholarship on Gentili's rhetorical theory focuses on exemplarity and Virgil. But the two De Rebelli books, by Gentili and Grotius, were backed by the two most important early modern commentaries on Aristotle's Poetics. And I'll try to show how the subtle differences between these commentaries may explain the radical differences between the methods of the two De Rebellis. I think that the methodological flaws in De Rebelli concerning ancient Rome are due to Gentili's endorsement of Scaliger's rejection of grammarian obsession with particulars at the expense of universals, and the incompleteness of Scaliger's proposals for motivating action in a better way. Examples aren't enough, But neither can international law be derived solely from poetry or philosophy, as indeed William Wellwood famously criticized Grotius's Mare Liberum for over-reliance on tragedy. Gentili was caught between the encyclopedic hoarding of examples that could, as he noted, never amount to general rules, and universals that should not lapse into philosophy or poetry. Gentili's best bet was deploying Roman law as a rickety bridge. What Gentili needed was a theory of verisimilitude which Scaliger Sr. could not give him. Now, verisimilitude is routinely mistranslated as probability. Indeed, Ian Hacking and Barbara Shapiro have given us seminal but misleading works on the early modern U-turn in understanding probability and its uses in juridical reasoning. Our sense of mathematical probability is clearly around by the time we get to Pascal and Fermat and Huygens. But this is not what Heinsius and Grotius meant by verisimilitude. After Heinsius' reshuffling of Aristotle's Poetics, verisimilitude became a practical tool for capturing a universal truth for which particulars may or may not exist. This is not even close to the idea of capturing a universal truth by aggregating and mathematically manipulating lots and lots of real particulars. It's a different animal entirely. Grotius constructed verisimilitude in De Jure Belli and Pacis by deploying philosophy or moral science in ways that are absent from Gentili's De Jure Belli, a point recently made by Professor Koskarniemi, by creating examples from multiple cultures and periods, by, unlike Gentili, not treating Rome as special, and by drawing on tragedy and fables. Indeed, many of the sources Grotius added to the 1631 edition of De Jure Belli and Pacis are literary, not legal, and this is in keeping with his praise of the potential of poetry in the 1630 preface for Euripides' Phoenice. Professor Galli argued that the De Jure Belli and Pacis is a universal machine for generating legal arguments from humanity's collective experience, when we met in April in Rome. I agree, and I would add that the Aristotelian Heinsian device of verisimilitude is key to this operation. It also seems to me that Grotius continued to develop his methodology, while De Imperio is still fundamentally encyclopedic, is stacking up examples. The use of verisimilitude is pitch perfect in the Veritate, and De Jure Belli and Pacis is somewhere in between. Now, Grotius, by contrast, rejects Roman law's applicability on clear methodological grounds. When he cites it approvingly, it is never his only source. Again, I went through the 3 books, not once. And he rejects numerous Roman provisions. Grotius also historicizes Roman law. Instead of encapsulating humanity's experience, it is merely the law of one society in a long-gone historical period, superseded even by customary laws that emerged since its demise, and to be rejected whenever it clashes with natural law. This historicization of Rome and the consequent creation of space for new doctrine is a chief reason for the success of De Jure Belli and Pacis. In his notes, Barbera praised Grotius' break with Rome, compared it favorably against Gentili's reliance on Rome. So Barbera noticed parts of this, and criticized Grotius for not eliminating Roman law entirely from the modern law of nations. While De Jure Belli began with Gentili's claim that the law of nations cannot be derived from Justinian, De Jure Belli and Pacis starts with Grotius announcing that none of the ancients or moderns have produced a usable treatment of the law of nations, partly because civilians are silly, canonists are wrong, and all relevant Roman law is lost. That's your introduction. Zooming in on Roman law, Grotius asserts that ancient Romans mistook natural law for the law of nations, and they conflated and terribly confused basic concepts as a consequence. Regarding Accursius, Bartolus, and other medieval and early Renaissance civilians and interpreters, Grotius thinks they've had useful ideas, but despises their mixture of canon law with Roman law, and doubts the philological accuracy of their reconstructions of Roman law to begin with. Finally, with regard to near contemporary interpreters, the third age of Roman law, Grotius dismissed his Spanish scholastics, but regards Bodin and Othman useful for integrating historical incidents into source materials for determining the law of nations. We are far from Gentili's world, in which more than enough Roman law proper remains to underpin the modern law of nations. The methodological distinction between the three ages of Roman law is missing, and Bartolus, Alciato, Baudin, and controversies among civilians are read as learned commentaries on Roman law, rather than adaptations to serve modern purposes. Grotius, while he's at it, also severs the much-wanted tie between natural law and the law of nations, as best expressed, according to Gentiliana and others, in Roman law. What does he do in practice? In his treatment of various topics, Grotius remains true to his methodological claims. If anything, he continues to limit the applicability of ancient Roman law and history. And again, these are examples. So, for a start, there is not a single argument in De Rebellia Pacis where he relies on Romans only. And quite often on key doctrines such as Ferae Naturae or the freedom of the seas, he just says Roman law is utterly useless and irrelevant and tells you why. I'm not going to go through all the details here. To conclude, I agree that De Rebellia and De Rebellia Pacis are similar. The originality, the systematization, the secularizing effect, the list of topics, and the attention to method all attest to this. I noted that Gentili seldom relied on Roman law and history alone. I gave you 24 examples out of hundreds. And when he did, he sometimes did so to crystallize a rule that must be rejected, for instance, on poisoning. Much of this would have been understood by his readers as a bold departure. Yet Gentili also attributed the greatest authority to ancient Rome when it came to understanding the law of nations, regarded both Roman law and the Roman Empire as living and breathing entities, and derived several rules of the law of nations from Roman sources alone. Perhaps Grotius popped open the jar for the genie of modern international law only because Gentili loosened it. In any case, it is not prima facie implausible to talk of a Gentilian movement, the way Richard Falk, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, and others have spoken of a Grotian movement. Perhaps not with a coherent semantic range, but with a shared sense of originality. I am not the first to point out that Grotius was dissatisfied. As von Vollenhoven wrote in 1925, quote, with the method of applying the Justinian system to every part of law, unquote. Gentili's use of examples has been discussed by Christopher Warren and Francesca Iolaro, though not the failure of his exemplarity, nor the role of verisimilitude in Gentili or Grotius. Given practical constraints, my argument is also incomplete. It would be nice, for instance, to trace Rome in other works by both authors, especially because Gentili is so emphatic that his works are interconnected. It would be lovely to review his unpublished corrigenda and addenda to De Rebelli, which Professor Weifels has been examining in Oxford, including hundreds of references Gentili planned to incorporate in a future edition that never happened. Finally, one should place the Gentili-Grotius contrast on Rome into the broader context of the controversy, which goes back at least to Marsilius against Bartolus. What I think is original in this brief sketch of the parallel lives of De Rebellia and De Rebellia Pacis is the contrast between the two authors' methodological statements concerning Rome, the systematic examination of their methods in action, and the proposition that the reinvention of verisimilitude, which is not the same as probability, freed the law of nations in De Rebellia Pacis from reliance on exemplarity, the weak dialectic between particulars and universals, and the burden of Rome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this extremely researched, thoroughly researched presentation. I can't wait to read your paper, maybe before it's being published, or certainly after. And I would leave it to the debate for the specialists to interact with you. I don't dare, even though I took some pieces of inspiration for tomorrow's discussion on at least the methodology that you read into the two great masters, which, as much as they start on the discussion about the foundation of the Grundnorm, they all very much seem to rely on actual practice, isn't it? That being said, the floor is open for the debate. I had promised some remarks on, yet more remarks from me, just very few, on Marty's presentation. I had taken notes which I can't find, but very, very quickly, I very much enjoyed your presentation, obviously, and I think your narrative also very much is very much confirmed by many, many, many examples in history, and I think of the regime of capitulations with the Ottoman Empire, which I suppose you haven't mentioned just in the interest of time. But I even date back to the practice of Venice at the time when it was a maritime republic which exercised political sovereignty and private property rights on certain harbors in the Black Sea, back in the days when it was a maritime republic, which is a kind of exercise of mixed public and private sort of power, as you would say. And my last remark is about you, and I want to share in public parts of our discussion about investor-state disputes, just because I am involved. I have problems of conscience, and I have problems of conscience not so much or only when sitting as an arbitrator, but also from a purely scholarly, intellectual honesty perspective. And this whole debate brings us back to the basic issue of the legitimacy, not just of that particular dispute settlement system, but of the whole structure of public international law, which is precisely criticized by critical legal studies. And as far as that particular body of international law is concerned, I want to share with you what I shared with Marty. I said, yes, I very much sympathized with the reform of the system, Western system of investment treaty dispute settlement, which is a way to put pressure on developing countries, serving the interest of the economic mighty Western powers. And I noticed that only a decade ago, Bolivarian states from Latin America formally pulled out from these investment treaty protection and promotion treaties and said there is the source of the reform from the global south. Until I noticed, as a matter of fact, that the major blows to the system are coming from the United States. I read the reports from the digest of the workings of the Congress, and I read statements from ultra-conservative Republican congressmen that could be copied and pasted and attributed to Maduro. What are these international arbitrators doing with regard to our public policy being applied to foreign investors? And that happened because Canadian companies sued the government of the United States for creeping expropriation or something of the sort. So, ultra-conservative American congressmen. Then another blow comes from the Commission of the European Union, which wants to replace these arbitration panels with a standing permanent court. And when I sit as an arbitrator, I say, gosh, we are the three of us, and we have on our hands actually serious public interest concerns of nation states that have an impact on people. At the same time, I'm wondering, if I were sitting in a court together with other 10 or 14, 11 or 15 members, would I be able to exercise my adjudicatory duties in any better, more balanced, honest, efficient way? I think that the more you are, the more stakes are being considered that pertain to a sort of a give and take kind of formula. So maybe the best way forward would be just to do away with any adjudicative system. And the other thing that I wanted to note is that the United Nations UNCTAD Commission provides data whereby, as much as the narrative, which probably reflected the truth, was that in the early days of this arbitration system, the applicants, private corporations, would have the upper hand, would win more cases than states. Now the statistics indicate that is the other way around, that states are now introducing sovereign interest protection clauses in bilateral investment treaties. My concern is that the system will perpetuate itself by, if you do away with investment treaties, we'll have foreign multinational corporations investing into developing countries through contracts, may be obtained through corruption, and that would corroborate my guess that perfection is the enemy of the good. And in the end, last remark, when I went to Latin America and I said, well, you Bolivarian countries are happy to do away with the system as supported by the European Union, I said, oh, this is very, very naive. If we do away with investment treaties, we are left in the hands of corporations to private contracts. So I think it is not an easy story. And when I, with great respect that I had for Professor Stiglitz, I was very much against the investor-state system, quoted wrong statistics. So I don't know. I still believe that perfection is the enemy of the good there, and I'll stop here. That was just to provoke, again, even though before in private we nearly agreed, but I wanted to provoke you to see if we can disagree more for the sake of debate. So the floor is open for other questions from the audience. Carlo, vorresti dire qualcosa? No, niente.
I'm happy to respond to you. Okay, so the acoustics isn't excellent here. So I think I can do with this. I wouldn't want to preempt any one of you taking the floor. I saw no one seemed to ask for the floor, and a provocation was made to me. So let me just say a few words about the nature of the presentation you have heard. The nature was not that of political reformist making a suggestion regarding some procedural arrangement concerning investment arbitration today. What is the nature of the kind of overview of history that I've made to you and the terrible injustices that exist in the present? In popular understanding, I suppose, the expectation often is that a historical presentation that has I suppose, critical remarks, if not directly, then at least hidden in the history itself, that the outcome would be a reform proposal. It sometimes even seems to me that one is only legitimate in making a large-scale historical critique if the critique ends in a reform proposal. To respond to that expectation, whether or not it exists, I don't know. But to respond, I will have to start by saying that I prohibit my PhD students and my other students from ending their thesis on a policy proposal. Why do I do this? Well, because the policy proposal can always be shot down in 5 minutes. And that will then infect the great work that they've done in order to prepare the ground for the policy proposal. An academic is not the underlaborer of political decision makers. Academics is not about producing new interpretations or new policies. Academics is about understanding. It's about understanding how the world is as it is. I've not yet met an academic discipline, and I'm thinking of political science and economics in particular, that would have been very successful in producing policy proposals. I have participated in countless debates between political economists who disagree, between political scientists who disagree, between sociologists who disagree, between lawyers who disagree. Even if those academic experts sometimes agree on issues on the surface, they always disagree on very basic things. That's why these fields exist as fields of academic expertise. If there were no disagreement, we would need no expertise. Things would have been resolved. I am presenting to you as an academic. I've also been acting as a politician, taking sides. I've been a counsel to parties. And if you are counsel to a party, it's reasonably easy to take a position because the law always gives you the position. Law always says both yes and no. And whatever you say depends on what your client wants you to say, your state wants you to say, your political party wants you to say. Law is a language. And like with any language, you can say both yes and no. And like with any language, you can say both stupid things and wise things. Law gives you the means to do all of that. As an academic, I analyze the way in which law enables us to say wise things and stupid things. But the wisdom and the stupidity is not given by the law. It's given by other things. I am not making a proposal about investment protection. To ask to choose between bilateral investment arbitration as it is now and between the present EU proposal being debated in Commission 3 of the UN Commission on International Trade Law is to ask to choose between Casa Nostra and Dangreta. I'm not interested in that choice. Other people have to make it, if they have to make it, if they feel it as interesting. It's really hard to understand how the world has become as it is. the older I become, the more puzzled I am, the less sure I am about what to do with it. But the more imperative I think it is to think about it hard and try to tell the stories that there are about people who have been winning and people who have been losing. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I am intellectually most satisfied by your answer, and I believe that particularly in such complicated, complex times, it is important that those who have to make policy decisions understand what they are deciding about, and the role of academicians, scholars, would definitely be that of helping those who one day may make decisions understand what has happened in the past, what is happening in the present, and what we might do in order to redress what went wrong in the past. Fact is that since, as I believe, most decision makers do not understand what they are deciding about, then in this sort of dédoublement fonctionnel in which we find ourselves, I tend to come up with policy decision suggestions, and I express my views on that. But I thank you very much. I know that there is a request for the floor for a question by Carlo Galli and one by Mark. Professor Galli.
La questione che si viene delineando in realtà è quella contro la quale, quando si ragiona in termini scientifici, si va sempre a sbattere, cioè qual è il ruolo dell'intellettuale accademico? La risposta è stata capire perché come e perché il mondo è diventato ciò che è, il che va assolutamente bene. Però non dobbiamo nascondere il fatto che vi sono molti modi per capire come il mondo è diventato ciò che è. Voglio dire che la nostra condizione di studiosi il più possibile, diciamo, seri, obiettivi, dotati di una capacità critica analitica. Ecco, la nostra condizione non è neutralizzabile fino in fondo. E facciamo subito un esempio. Giustamente è stato detto, attenzione, la storia, poniamo, tanto avete capito, stiamo parlando solo di Occidente qui. L'Occidente è oggi circa un ottavo del mondo e i restanti 7/8 non ci amano, chiudo la parentesi. In ogni caso, la storia, diciamo, dal tardo medioevo a oggi non è stata fatta, cioè non è ricostruibile soltanto attraverso la lente della sovranità, cioè del conflitto fra universalismi medievali, imperi, statualità moderne nazionali, loro dissoluzione nel XX secolo e punto interrogativo. Ma bisogna mettere in conto anche che, diciamo, almeno metà dell'opera è giocata non solo dalla sovranità, ma anche dall'economia, ovviamente, con il fatto che la sovranità e l'economia hanno logiche e strategie sostanzialmente opposte, dato che la sovranità è chiusa, territoriale, e invece l'economia è, anche se si allea, se si è alleata per una certa fase con la sovranità, l'economia è tendenzialmente universalistica. Vero. Ma dopo che abbiamo ricostruito questo campo di tensioni fra, diciamo, particolarismo e universalismo, abbiamo ancora, e dobbiamo ricostruirlo con attenzione, appunto vedendo come le due logiche si sono tra di loro intrecciate, come la cannoniera ha seguito i mercanti o i mercanti abbiano seguito la cannoniera. Beh, come il governo sia stato il consiglio d'amministrazione, il comitato d'affari della borghesia o non lo sia stato. Cioè, abbiamo ancora da decidere volta per volta, caso per caso, chi ha gestito l'agire politico economico, chi lo ha assecondato, chi lo ha invece solo seguito. Cioè, se io vi dicessi che dopo una vita che ci penso ho risolto questo problema dicendo prima di tutto non è risolubile, ma poi come vi dico adesso sono certo che susciterò insurrezioni e gravi reprimende, ma ve lo dico lo stesso. Se dovessi spiegare a me stesso, prima di tutto, che cosa è successo e che cosa sta succedendo, io direi più o meno così. C'è una base, se fossi un marxista, a volte lo sono, a volte no, se fossi un marxista direi una struttura, ecco, una struttura di fondo che è, detto in modo brutale, geopolitica. Cioè il fatto che un universalismo reale con caratteristiche di efficacia. Ecco. E in questo pianeta, che è un pianeta piccolo, che non conta niente, bene, non di meno, non è possibile. Questo pianeta è strutturalmente plurale sotto il profilo politico. Sopra questo, ho detto la parola plurale suona bene, sembra particolarmente tollerante, in realtà vuol dire che ci sono le guerre e che esiste una pluralità di attori che hanno interessi non coincidenti. Poi come gestiscono questi interessi? Li possono gestire in modo brutale o in modo invece soft, però sono interessi non coincidenti. Perché sono coincidenti? Perché il grosso della logica politica è grande estensione territoriale e accesso al mare libero. Allora, ad avere grande estensione territoriale e accesso al mare libero sono pochi. Molti lo desiderano, pochi ci riescono. Sotto questa triste realtà ci sono le guerre. Se questa è la struttura, vedete che si prescinde completamente dal fatto che queste entità politiche plurali siano come democratiche, autocratiche, autoritarie. Si prescinde completamente. Detto questo, sopra, ma non sopra astrattamente, sopra in modo tale che questo sopra interagisce col sotto, ecco, sopra ci sono delle potenze universalistiche che sono la tecnica, che è universale, sono l'economia, che è una potenza universale, il diritto, che è una lingua universale, la morale. Se noi ci mettiamo tutte questo rapporto, ecco, in questo rapporto fra una realtà politica strutturalmente plurale e una serie di non sovrastrutture, di strutture ideali e materiali, perché l'economia è materiale e come, ma anche la tecnica è materiale e come, di strutture dotate di una logica intrinsecamente universale e cerchiamo di capire come i soggetti plurali della politica cercano di appropriarsi delle dimensioni universali e come queste dimensioni universali cercano di addomesticare o comunque di organizzare secondo le proprie logiche quegli interessi particolari. Ecco, se noi mettiamo insieme tutto ciò, noi abbiamo descritto il mestiere di un'intera facoltà, anzi di più facoltà, della facoltà di scienze politiche, della facoltà di giurisprudenza, forse anche di quella di filosofia, se i filosofi hanno voglia di fare qualcosa di utile nella vita, una volta tanto. Insomma, un bel po' di saperi, di sociologie, un bel po' di saperi, tutti all'opera. Questo però, e qui chiudo, vuol dire, secondo me, che chi fa il nostro mestiere è costretto a prendere una serie enorme di decisioni interpretative. Le può prendere in malafede o in buona fede, con competenza o con incompetenza, ma di decisioni interpretative il nostro sapere vive, perché se i meccanismi che vi ho detto sono vagamente verosimili, a questo punto però bisogna capire chi è che ha mosso tutto. Ha mosso la borghesia e questa borghesia era progressista, ma anche quando faceva operazioni coloniali. Voglio dire, Grozio, facciamo subito un esempio e chiudo. Grozio, nel suo universalismo, concepisce come guerra giusta, fra le infinite fattispecie di guerra giusta, la rottura di di un patto, di un contratto. Ecco, la rottura di un contratto ovunque questo contratto sia stato stipulato nel mondo, chiunque siano i contraenti e dovunque sia stato rotto. Il che vuol dire, tradotto in soldoni, che la Compagnia delle Riunite delle Indie Orientali fa un contratto col re delle Molucche sulla cessione della noce moscata in esclusiva agli olandesi. Non sto dicendo delle battute, la noce moscata era il bene più prezioso dell'universo. Ecco, cioè, quello per cui si sono fatte le spedizioni marine dal 400 in poi era la noce moscata. Quando la Golden Hind entra nel porto di Londra piena di spezie, è arrivato il più grande carico di valore della storia dell'umanità. Bene. Poniamo che il re delle Molucche non capisca un accidente di contratti o che li capisca come può, perché viene da una cultura completamente diversa e un bel giorno si mette a cedere noce moscata ai portoghesi. A quel punto la Compagnia delle Indie fa guerra giusta al re delle Molucche. L'universalismo è anche questo, la protezione degli investimenti è anche questo. Su questo prendiamo posizione? Cioè ci accorgiamo che qui c'è una politica che, come dislivello di potere, che passa attraverso qualche cosa che sembra invece paritetico, come un contratto? Punto interrogativo. E se ce ne accorgiamo, lo diciamo? Lo mettiamo nero su bianco e ne tiriamo qualche conseguenza teorica o pratica? Ecco, io mi sono sempre trovato nella mia modesta prestazione intellettuale, mi sono sempre trovato nella necessità di prendere decisioni interpretative, certo di accumulare materiale, di imparare quante più cose si può, soprattutto da grandissimi studiosi come quelli che abbiamo avuto la fortuna di avere con noi oggi. Però alla fine, io dico, scusate, quel testo che ci è stato fatto vedere prima, 1843, quel testo inglese in cui non lo conoscevo e resto esterrefatto, vi sembra qualche cosa sul quale non si debba dire che lì c'è un universalismo politico paragonabile a quello dell'imperatore cinese, il quale pensava che tutto il mondo fosse di diritto soggetto a lui, imperatore cinese. E noi l'abbiamo deriso dicendo povero pazzoide, no? Beh, nel 1843 la regina d'Inghilterra sosteneva di avere il diritto di intervenire ovunque nel pianeta Terra. Avrà un senso questa cosa? Cioè questa trasformazione della politica, la vogliamo interpretare da politica territoriale chiusa, dove c'è una sovranità che comanda su un territorio, a una sovranità che invece diventa improvvisamente universalistica come l'economia che in questo punto le sta sotto e la guida. Lo vogliamo dire? Ne traiamo qualche conseguenza? L'adoperiamo questo come decifrazione del modo in cui il mondo è arrivato a essere quello che è, magari con sostituzione dell'Inghilterra da parte degli Stati Uniti? Questo non è una provocazione, no, è eh, una tarda confessione di un tardo studioso sui dilemmi interpretativi che continuamente si presentano a chi pratica le nostre discipline. Scusate il tempo che vi ho fatto perdere.
Grazie. There was the last question from Mark.
Thank you.
Can you speak very, very slowly?
Of course. Thank you. I have a very quick but very slow question for Professor Koskaniemi. It is a very convincing argument, and I completely believe what you said concerning the cardinal role that sovereignty and property play, and the unholy combination of private and public property. And my question is, I would like to ask, not for a policy advice, but for a similarly high-level theoretical alternative. So it is clearly the case that public authority is required to create or extinguish private property, to register and document it, to regulate it, or to adjudicate between parties that have a dispute. It's also the case, obviously, through history, that every now and then a sovereign needs to exercise eminent domain, whether they are building an aqueduct, or waging a war, or setting up electrical power lines. And it is difficult to conceive of a historical situation or a theoretical situation in which private and public property and sovereignty and property are not inextricably linked. Which is why, if it is the case that God gave the whole world to us in common, and if that is the case, I'm going to have follow-up questions. And if it is also the case that we are dangerous to each other, then public authority is necessary for private property to make sense to begin with. Which is why I thought that your yin-yang parallel was perfect. It's a white part and it's a black part, and there's a bit of each in the other. And they don't work without each other. So I can't think of an alternative, and if there is no alternative to this combination, then isn't your analytical point important as it is? Just end up as a more say semantic point.
Well, law is language, and if something ends up as a semantic point, I think that's not a problem. So maybe. So I don't know about the universal nature of the succession of examples that I gave and my interpretation as to how those came together. And I was listening to your wonderful presentation as to how Gentili related to the examples that he gave, both critically and then absorbing the examples. Obviously, my narrative does not wish to say anything about the essence of sovereignty or property, nor about a necessary history that would start from some original starting point where humans are either sociable or wolves to each other. All of that is just parts of narrative that are familiar to us. But when we talk about the past, it is these narratives that interpret it to us, and they have to be taken seriously. Therefore, my interest in telling these stories is like everything that I do, is an interest in the present. So I'm a very presentist person, and not a real historian in that sense. So not an antiquarian. And I'm interested in telling this story in order to create in the audience a sense that these arrangements and techniques that we have presently are not there because they had to be like that. And to show that in history there have been many different kinds of ways to use ideas about sovereignty and property, or to be more clear, languages of sovereignty and property to produce distributionary consequences in different ways. In the present political discourse, there often is put forward the view that the present is as it is because it cannot be otherwise. I want to break that sense. By showing that with these very primitive linguistic tools that we have, sovereignty and property, public law and private law, we have been able to create configurations that are very different from the present, in order to suggest that we might learn from those configurations to change the present configuration as well, and through changing that configuration, influencing the distribution of material and spiritual resources in the world. And it is that latter concern, and only that latter concern, that can possibly justify the kinds of privileges that I and other academics enjoy, to talk to you and to listen to you and to come to places like the San Ginesio to enjoy your hospitality and to live in the way that we do. So in this sense, although law is language and a technique and a very abstract thing, I want to make it seem that it all comes together in us being here, speaking this language and finding from that language resources through which we can make the world a better place.
There are no other questions from the floor, which I think there are none. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Professor Galli, molte grazie. Grazie a tutti e a domani.
Thank you.